You have no idea what it feels like to walk down the aisle, heart pounding with joy, only to tear your own wedding apart in front of 200 people. I didn't trip on my gown or faint from nerves I exposed a monster, a man everyone adored, a man I was supposed to marry that very afternoon. They called me the bride who said no, but I wasn't just saying no to a wedding. I was saying no to silence, no to shame, and no to the idea that a woman should ever be afraid to tell the truth, even on her wedding day. My name is Charlene Chapman, and I live in the quiet town of Franklin, Tennessee, where most folks now know me as Grandma Charlene, the silver-haired lady who walks with a cherrywood cane and grows heirloom roses out back near the porch. I'm 83 now, and on the outside, I might look like just another old woman with a gentle voice and a warm smile, but if you knew what I carried inside, you'd understand that survival doesn't always leave scars you can see. Every Sunday, I bake cornbread and sit on my porch with a book or two. I wave to my neighbors, I feed the squirrels, and I listen to the sound of wind chimes echoing through the Tennessee breeze. And yet, there's one sound I still remember more vividly than anything else: the silence in the church after I spoke those 6 words that would change my life forever. There will be no wedding today. For over 6 decades, I kept the details of that day mostly to myself. Oh, folks in town whispered about it, and plenty made up their own stories. Some said I lost my mind. Others believed I ran off with another man. No one ever guessed the truth, because it was too awful to imagine, and I let them believe what they wanted, until now, today. I'm telling this story not because I want pity, and certainly not for fame. I'm telling it because somewhere there might be a woman feeling trapped, silenced, afraid. Maybe she's younger than I ever was. Maybe she's older. Maybe she's never told a soul what was done to her. This is for her. You see, my story didn't begin in that church. It started years earlier, on a humid summer afternoon in 1955, when I first met Edward Foster. Back then, Franklin wasn't the charming suburban sprawl it is now. It was a small southern town built on tradition, where Sundays were for church, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where the pharmacy on Main Street was the heart of the community. My daddy, Samuel Chapman, owned that very pharmacy, a good, honest man who mixed his own tinctures, patched up scrapes, and knew every child by name. My mother, Elaine, was a piano teacher who gave lessons to all the well-off girls, hoping to impress at cotillions and garden parties. We weren't wealthy, but we had respect. People greeted us with smiles and treated us kindly. I spent most of my days helping behind the counter, dusting shelves or organizing labels, while dreaming about the world beyond Franklin. Then one day, a man walked into the store holding a folded prescription and smiling like the summer sun itself. That man was Edward. He had just moved from Nashville, sent by the bank to manage the local branch. Tall, well-dressed, with sharp green eyes and a voice as smooth as butter. He seemed like someone from a movie reel. His manners were polished, his cologne subtle but expensive, and he always said ma'am and sir with a gentle southern drawl. The first time I looked up and saw him standing at the counter, I swear I forgot how to breathe. He came in for aspirin. I handed it to him with trembling fingers. Our conversation was short, maybe 2 minutes, but that night I couldn't sleep. His voice kept replaying in my head like a lullaby wrapped in silk. The next Sunday after church, Edward approached my mama and me as we walked through the town square. He asked if he could accompany us. My mother raised an eyebrow, but after a moment, she gave a polite nod. And that's how it began, our old-fashioned courtship. Always chaperoned, always proper. Edward was the perfect gentleman. He sent flowers every week, brought my mother fresh peaches, and gifted me poetry books with notes scribbled in the margins. By the 3rd month, he was eating Sunday dinner with us and holding my hand under the table. Everyone in town adored him. He's a keeper, folks would whisper. You're a lucky girl. Charlene. I believed them. And when he asked to officially court me, my mama cried tears of joy. You did well, sweetheart, she said. You're going to have a good life with him. I thought so too. For a long time, I truly did. But sometimes what shines on the outside is only hiding the darkness within. And I would only learn the truth when it was almost too late. From the moment Edward slipped that delicate engagement ring on my finger, a modest diamond set in rose gold, my life turned into a whirlwind of planning, praise, and dreams painted in pastels. The whole town of Franklin buzzed about the upcoming wedding between Edward Foster, the promising young bank manager, and me, Charlene Chapman, the daughter of the local pharmacist. It felt like a fairy tale. The kind little girls were raised to long for, only back then. We didn't know that sometimes fairy tales have monsters hiding behind the prince's smile. Edward was every inch the Southern gentleman. He opened doors, pulled out chairs, and quoted scripture at family dinners. But more than that, he made me feel seen. He spoke to me like I mattered not just as someone's daughter or someone's future wife, but as a person with thoughts and dreams of my own. Looking back now, I can see how good he was at playing the part, how he mirrored exactly what I wanted to believe. But at the time, I didn't question any of it. I was 20 in love and floating on clouds of lavender-scented linen and bridal lace. The engagement was announced in the Sunday bulletin at First Baptist Church. My mama sent handwritten invitations to relatives across Tennessee and beyond. My aunts, cousins, and neighbors began showing up with advice, casserole dishes, and old wedding photos. For 6 months, every minute of my life revolved around the wedding. We chose the church sanctuary with its tall white columns and polished wood pews. The date was set for May 12th, 1957. The reception would be held at the Franklin Civic Club, the grandest hall in town. My dress was ordered from a boutique in Nashville ivory silk with lace sleeves and pearl buttons that ran all the way down the back. I remember the day it arrived. Mama opened the box and gasped like she'd just laid eyes on heaven itself. "You'll look like a queen," she whispered, wiping her eyes. Everything was perfect, or so it seemed. We picked out embroidered linens, hand-lettered place cards, and matching blue bridesmaids' dresses with soft ribbon sashes. There would be white lilies, a string quartet, and 300 white orchids ordered from a greenhouse all the way in Georgia. Edward insisted on the orchids. "Lilies are your favorite," he said with a wink, "but orchids, they'll make the whole town talk." He was already building the house we were supposed to move into after the honeymoon, a 2-story white colonial on Maplewood Avenue with a wraparound porch, a breakfast nook, and even a telephone installed in the upstairs hallway. That was a big deal back then. He said we'd take our honeymoon in New York City. I'd never been north of Kentucky. We talked about the future often, where the crib would go, what we'd name our children. He wanted 3, I wanted 4. He preferred modern furniture. I loved antique pieces. We laughed about those things, the way young couples do when they believe love can solve everything. Then came the week of the wedding. Family from all corners began arriving, filling every spare bed and sleeping space in the house. My great-uncle Calvin, who hadn't traveled in 20 years, came in from Mississippi. My mama's sisters took over the kitchen like a battalion. It was joyful chaos. And among the guests was Heather Davis, my cousin on Daddy's side, the daughter of my Aunt Ruth from Chattanooga. Heather and I were only 2 years apart and had been inseparable as kids. When her family moved away, we kept up through letters filled with doodles, secrets, and dreams. I hadn't seen her in over 3 years, and the moment I spotted her stepping off the train, I ran to hug her like we were 12 again. She had grown into a beautiful young woman, tall and willowy, with long brown hair and those big, thoughtful eyes I remembered so well. She'd always been the quieter one, more reserved, more sensitive. The day after she arrived, I introduced her to Edward at a luncheon my mother hosted. He, of course, was his usual charming self, polite, attentive, asking her about her studies and her hometown with that effortless warmth everyone loved. Heather smiled, answered softly, but her eyes stayed low. I thought she was just being shy. It was her nature, after all. I didn't think much of it then, but as the week wore on, I began noticing subtle things that seemed small at the time. Heather started avoiding me. If I walked into a room, she'd find a reason to leave. When we spoke about the wedding, her responses were clipped, almost detached. At first, I figured she was just tired from the trip or overwhelmed by the chaos of the house. But there were moments when I'd catch her looking at Edward, not looking, flinching, like she was bracing for something. One night, 3 days before the wedding, I found her alone on the back porch, staring out into the garden. I sat beside her and asked if something was wrong. She smiled tight, fragile. Just tired. Charlene, she said, everything's so beautiful. You're lucky. There was something hollow in her voice. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away gently, standing up and saying she needed to rest. I watched her walk back inside, the screen door closing softly behind her. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, but I didn't press. I didn't want anything to cloud the most important day of my life. Looking back now, I wish I had. I wish I had seen the cracks beneath the surface before the entire dream shattered in front of everyone I loved. But sometimes it takes a storm to show you who someone really is. And the storm was coming. The night before my wedding should have been filled with joy, anticipation, and maybe a few nervous giggles over tea and satin veils. Instead, there was a quiet unease threading through every moment, one I couldn't quite name. By then, I'd chalked up Heather's distant behavior to exhaustion or shyness, but deep down, something inside me was starting to churn. I could sense a shadow following us, even as everyone around me celebrated. The house was full to the brim. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and neighbors all tucked into guest rooms and sleeping bags. Mama was bustling around, making sure every detail was in place for the big day. My wedding dress hung in the back of her bedroom closet, still wrapped in lace-covered tissue. I tried it on one last time that morning, and Mama had clapped her hands like a child. "You're gonna take his breath away, baby girl," she whispered, smoothing a curl from my forehead. And I believed her. I wanted to believe her. That night, as tradition dictated, I stayed at my parents' house. Edward had gone out with his groomsmen for a tame little dinner at the diner on Main Street. No bar, no wild bachelor antics. He made a point to mention that. "You know me," he'd said with a grin. "Nothing flashy, just a few toasts with the boys." Heather helped me get ready for bed. Or rather, she sat on the edge of the bed, silent and still, while I pinned my hair and sorted the tiara of gardenias I'd wear with my veil. Her hand stayed clenched in her lap. She hadn't touched the tea Mama brought up for us. "Are you nervous?" I asked, trying to draw her out. She looked up at me slowly, her eyes rimmed with something deeper than fatigue. They weren't red like someone who hadn't slept. They were red like someone who had cried until there were no tears left. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice was thin, barely a whisper. "Heather," I said, turning to face her. "What's wrong?" She hesitated. Then, out of nowhere, she reached forward and grabbed both my hands in hers. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. I remember the way her fingers trembled in mine. "Charlene," she said, "are you absolutely sure this is the man you want to marry?" I blinked, stunned. "Of course I am. Why would you ask me that?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched mine, wide and pleading. She looked like she was trying to scream without making a sound. "He's perfect. Heather, you've seen him. Everyone loves him." She bit her lower lip and let go of my hands, drawing back like she'd touched a flame. "Forget I said anything," she mumbled. "It's nothing. Just nerves, I guess. You know how big days like this can be." Then she stood up and said goodnight. I didn't sleep well that night. I tossed and turned, my mind circling that question over and over again. Are you absolutely sure? What did she mean? Why now? On the eve of the most important day of my life. The next morning, sunlight spilled into my room through the lace curtains. Mama was already up, banging pans in the kitchen and calling out times like a town crier. "Hairdresser comes at 10. Charlene, you better be up and dressed before then." The whole house smelled like lilac soap and biscuits. My dress was laid out on the bed. Everything was going according to plan, or so it seemed. But Heather wasn't at breakfast. I asked Mama where she was, said she forgot something at Miss Eugenia's place, and went to get it. Mama said offhandedly, "She'll be back soon." But she didn't sound sure. I didn't have time to worry. The hairdresser showed up, bustling in with curlers and hairspray. Ants swarmed around me, fixing things, smoothing fabric, offering advice I didn't need. And then I'll never forget it. There was a sound from downstairs, raised voices, a door opening too hard, a quiet sob, muffled behind a closed door. Mama came into my room moments later, her face pale beneath her foundation. "Just a little hiccup with the flower arrangements," she said, smiling too tightly. "Nothing for you to worry about." But I did worry. I knew my mother's face too well. Then I heard it quiet crying, coming from the room down the hall. Heather. My stomach dropped. Something was terribly wrong. I rose from the vanity chair, ignoring the protest of the hairdresser still working on my curls. "Charlene," she called, but her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. I walked through the house in a daze, drawn by that sound, the kind of crying you never forget once you've heard it. A soul-deep sound. I opened the guest room door slowly, and there she was. Heather sat hunched on the bed, her face buried in her hands. Her dress, the pale yellow one she was meant to wear as my bridesmaid, was wrinkled and cast aside on a chair. A dark stain near the neckline told a story before she ever spoke. Her lip was split, one eye swollen. A bruise bloomed along her cheekbone. My aunt, her mother, sat beside her, holding her shoulders, whispering useless comfort. I froze. It felt like the room had no air. "What happened?" I asked, my voice louder than I meant it to be. They looked up, both of them startled like I'd shattered glass. Heather shook her head, her eyes filling with fresh tears. My aunt stood quickly, trying to block my view. "She's just not feeling well. Nothing to worry about." "Honey, no." I interrupted. Tell me the truth. I moved past her and knelt in front of Heather, taking her cold, shaking hands into mine. Who did this to you? I asked softly. Heather opened her mouth, and at first nothing came out. Then, barely above a whisper, 2 words fell like stones into the silence. Edward did. At first, I didn't understand. Heather's voice was so soft I thought I'd misheard. Edward did. It didn't make sense. My Edward, the man who held my hand so gently, who quoted poetry and kissed my forehead in front of my mother. I stared at her, blinking, waiting for a correction, for someone to say she was mistaken. But instead, Heather burst into tears, and Aunt Ruth broke down beside her. My knees went weak. I reached for the side of the bed to steady myself. My mother, hearing the commotion, entered the room. Her face, already lined with concern, turned ghost white when she saw Heather. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. For a moment, all 4 of us stood frozen, connected by one devastating truth that shattered every illusion I had about the day. It was Edward. It was Edward. I knelt beside my cousin again, my hands still gripping hers, though I barely felt them. Heather, I said, my voice catching, please tell me exactly what happened. She hesitated, glancing at her mother, at mine, then back at me, then slowly, like dragging herself up from the bottom of a well, she began. He came this morning, early, she whispered, her voice hoarse, said he wanted to drop off a surprise, something for you. I nodded numbly. And you were here alone? Yes. Aunt Elaine had gone to pick up the lilies. My parents went to get Grandma from the hotel. I thought it was fine. It was Edward. After all, she choked on the name. He said he just wanted to see the room. He asked to see your dress. I told him no, that it was bad luck. I could barely breathe. He changed. His smile turned into something else. He said he'd always found me attractive. That ever since lunch the other day. He couldn't stop thinking about me. Heather was shaking now. I tried to leave. He blocked the door, said he wanted an advance on what he'd be getting tonight. I told him no. I told him to leave. Tears spilled down her face. I screamed, but no one heard. The house was full, but it was so loud outside with the kids playing in the yard, the trucks on the road. He put his hand over my mouth. Her body tensed. He forced me against the wall. I couldn't move. I closed my eyes. I couldn't hear more, but I had to. He hit me when I tried to fight. When he finished, he wiped his face, straightened his tie, and said, "Don't ruin her day, sweetheart. No one would believe you anyway." Then he walked out like nothing happened. My mother was sobbing behind me now, her hands clutched over her heart. Aunt Ruth sat silently on the edge of the bed, tears pouring down her face. I was in shock. I could feel the air vibrating, but no sound registered, just Heather's quiet crying, just the heaviness in my chest growing and growing until I couldn't hold it anymore. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, barely able to hear myself. "We tried," Aunt Ruth said, her voice trembling. "Your father and Paul went looking for him. We thought about canceling the wedding without telling you why. We didn't want to hurt you. You were so happy." That word happy felt like poison. Happy I was supposed to marry a monster in 4 hours. Happy my cousin had just been assaulted, and everyone was tiptoeing around me like I was made of glass. "I'm not the one who needed protecting," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Heather did, and none of you did a damn thing." Silence followed. Stunned silence. I stood up slowly, My dress was still hanging in the other room. My hair was half done, one side still pinned, the other falling over my shoulder. And yet, in that moment, I felt more awake than I'd ever been. Where is he now? I asked. Last we heard, he went back to the hotel where the groomsmen are staying. My mother said he had errands to run before the ceremony. I nodded, numb but alive. We're not canceling the wedding, I said. Everyone looked at me like I'd gone mad. Mama clutched my arm. Charlene, baby, what are you saying? I'm saying the wedding will go on, just not the way Edward planned. Aunt Ruth's eyes widened. What? What do you mean? I mean, I'm going to walk down that aisle in my dress, in front of every guest, and I'm going to look Edward Foster in the eye, and I'm going to tell them all what he did. No, child, Mama said, her voice breaking. That's not how we handle things. It'll ruin you. I'm already ruined. Mama, I whispered, just not in the way you think. That's when I asked for Miss Eugenia Carter, our family's longtime friend and my godmother. If there was one woman in Franklin who didn't give a damn about appearances, it was her, a widow for over a decade. She ran one of the largest farms in the county, hired her own workers, handled her own money, and still found time to attend every church fundraiser. When she arrived, I told her everything, every vile word, every bruise on Heather's face, every lie Edward ever told. And I told her what I wanted to do. She didn't cry. She didn't blink. She leaned back in the rocking chair, narrowed her eyes, and said, "That will be the biggest scandal this town has ever seen." I nodded. Good. She smiled. Not a soft smile, but a fierce, knowing one. Then let's give them something to talk about. Within minutes, Miss Eugenia had a plan. She whispered instructions to my uncle, made a few quiet calls from the kitchen phone, and even got the sheriff's office involved discreetly, just enough for them to be ready. Meanwhile, I returned to the bridal room. The hairdresser, still confused and shaken, tried to fix my curls again. The makeup artist dabbed powder over the tear streaks. On the outside, I was being turned into a perfect bride. But inside, something else was taking shape. A storm. And when the clock struck 4 p.m., I would no longer be the sweet little girl marrying the town's golden boy. I would be the woman who broke the silence and exposed a predator in front of every single person who once told me I was lucky to have him. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, everything was set. The guests had started arriving at the church friends, neighbors, relatives dressed in their finest. The sanctuary was draped in white satin ribbons, glistening under the stained glass windows. Lilies and orchids lined the aisle. The organist was playing soft hymns, and the air buzzed with hushed excitement. No one suspected that the bride was about to shatter everything. I stood in the small bridal room behind the sanctuary, fully dressed. My ivory gown hugged my frame, the veil pinned in place. My hands were calm, folded over the bouquet of white roses and lilies Mama had helped me choose months ago. The scent was overpowering, almost too sweet. Outside that room, the world believed it was minutes away from watching a fairy tale unfold. Inside, I was preparing for war. Miss Eugenia returned from her errands at exactly 3:15 p.m. "He's back," she whispered. "He arrived at the church 10 minutes ago, smiling, shaking hands like he hadn't destroyed a life this morning. Perfect," I said. I felt hollow, but also sharpened like a blade that had been through fire. My father walked in shortly after. He looked 10 years older than he had the night before. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His hands trembled when he took mine. "You don't have to do this. Charlene," he said gently, "we can say you're sick. We'll cancel. Quietly. No one will question it. No." "Daddy," I replied, "we've hidden enough already." He searched my face for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's go." We stepped out into the vestibule, the heavy wooden doors just beyond us. The organist switched to the wedding march, and the congregation rose as one. The moment had arrived. The doors opened, and I stepped forward, my arm tucked into my father's, my head held high beneath the veil. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. "She's beautiful. What a dress." "Edward's a lucky man." I focused only on the aisle on Edward. He stood at the altar, tall and composed in his gray suit, his hair slicked perfectly into place, his green eyes glinting with pride. When he saw me, his lips curved into that familiar smile, that smile, the one that had once made me feel safe. Now it made my skin crawl. Step by step, we walked forward. My heels tapped softly against the floor. The scent of orchids hung heavy in the air. As we neared the front pew, I glanced at Miss Eugenia. She caught my eye and nodded subtly. This was it. Edward extended his hand. "You look radiant," he whispered. I didn't take his hand. Instead, I raised my veil slowly and looked him dead in the eyes. My voice, when I spoke, was calm and clear. "There will be no wedding today." Gasps echoed through the sanctuary like thunder. A stunned silence followed. Even the organist froze, fingers suspended midair. Edward's smile faltered, confusion washing over his face. "What are you doing?" he murmured, his hands still outstretched. I stepped back. "Don't touch me," I said firmly. "Not now, not ever again." The whispers began, rising like a tide. I turned toward the congregation, my heart pounding but my spine straight. "Before you leave here thinking I simply got cold feet," I said, "you all deserve to know the truth." Edward's face paled. His father, seated in the front pew, shifted uncomfortably. My mother covered her mouth. Aunt Ruth held tight to Heather, who had just entered the sanctuary through a side door with Miss Eugenia guiding her by the arm. "This man, this so-called gentleman you've all praised, attacked my cousin Heather this morning, right here in Franklin, in my family's home, hours before this ceremony." A collective gasp rose. Edward took a step toward me. "She's lying," he hissed. "She's making it up. Stay back." I warned, raising my voice. "You've done enough." The entire church turned as Heather stepped forward, her lips still bruised, her posture fragile but upright. "She's telling the truth," Heather said, her voice shaking. "He came to the house this morning. He forced his way in. He hurt me." Edward's father stood, red-faced. "This is slander. You're ruining a respectable man's name." But before anyone else could speak, Mary, Edward's longtime housekeeper, rose from a back pew. "It's not the first time," she said, her voice firm. "He's done it before. To the baker's niece, to the blacksmith's daughter, to me." You could hear a pin drop. Mary walked down the aisle slowly, past stunned guests, past men turning white and women gripping their handbags like shields. I stayed silent for years. I was afraid, but no more. Edward snapped. "You filthy liar," he screamed, lunging toward Mary. Before he could reach her, 2 officers stepped into the aisle. Sheriff Harmon, an old friend of my father's, raised his voice. "Edward Foster," he boomed, "you're under arrest for assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent." Edward froze. For a moment, I thought he might try to run or fight or talk his way out of it like he always had. But the look on his face wasn't charm or confidence anymore. It was fear, real, hollowed-out fear. They cuffed him right there at the altar, right where we were supposed to exchange vows. The same altar where I would have promised to love and obey a man who had tried to destroy someone I loved. As they led him away, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply watched, my bouquet still in hand, my heart strangely steady. Heather came to my side, her eyes glistening with tears. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "I had to," I said. "For you, for me, for every girl he's ever hurt." And as the guests slowly filed out, too stunned to speak, I looked around the once beautiful sanctuary and felt something unexpected freedom, not just from Edward, but from fear, from silence, from everything that had ever told me to sit down and be quiet. That day, I didn't just refuse to marry a monster. I chose to stand for truth, and that changed everything. The church emptied slowly, like air leaking from a balloon that had once been puffed full of dreams. No one spoke to me directly, as they left not at first. There were too many stunned faces, too many whispered prayers and shaking heads. Some avoided my gaze altogether, as if they feared what they saw in me now. Not a bride, not a victim, something else entirely, something dangerous. I stood near the altar for what felt like hours, still wearing the gown that was supposed to begin my new life, now stained with truth instead of tradition. The orchids that Edward had insisted on were beginning to wilt under the weight of the afternoon heat. I stared at them, trying to feel anything, but I was numb. Mama and Daddy stood near the front pew, their arms around each other. My mother had finally stopped crying, though her eyes stayed red and swollen. My father's jaw was clenched. Neither one said, "I told you so." They didn't need to. Heather sat on the steps by the pulpit, still in her plain dress. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the bruises on her face now clear under the church's golden light. Miss Eugenia stood beside her like a silent guardian, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp. "We should go." Someone finally said, I think it was Aunt Ruth. But I didn't move. I felt rooted to the ground, as if the pain and shame and fury of everything that had happened had seeped into the soles of my feet. That's when the first woman approached me. It was Loretta Simmons, the baker's niece. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She stopped a few feet from me, twisting her fingers together nervously. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she whispered. "I never told anyone what he did to me. I thought it was my fault, that no one would believe me." Then she added, "But you made them listen." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. She stepped away. Then another woman came forward, and another. By the time we left the church, 5 more women had quietly confessed to having been mistreated, harassed, or worse always, by men like Edward, men who smiled in public and prayed in private, men no one ever suspected, men everyone trusted. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed in my old room. The dress finally peeled off and folded in the bottom drawer of my dresser. I stared out the window at the moon hanging low over Franklin, and I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't let this be the end of the story. It had to be the beginning. The next day, I met with Miss Eugenia and Heather on the back porch, our hands wrapped around steaming mugs of tea. None of us felt ready, but none of us could walk away. I keep thinking about all the girls who didn't say anything. I said, and the ones who will never say anything because they think no one will listen. Heather nodded slowly. I still don't know how you stood there in that dress and said all of that in front of everyone. I don't either, I said honestly, but I know why I did. It was Miss Eugenia who spoke next. Then we do something with it. We don't just survive, we build. And that's how the idea was born. At first, it was just a thought, a tiny flame in the dark. But by the following week, it had a name, the Franklin Women's Support Circle, a place where women could speak without judgment, without fear, without shame. Miss Eugenia offered a small meeting room at her farmhouse as our first gathering space. Heather agreed to share her story with others who were ready to speak up. Mama baked pies and brought them in silence. Her way of saying, I support you. And me, I became the one who held the door open, the one who listened, the one who made sure every woman who walked through that door knew she mattered. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't a sweeping movement, but it was something real. And from the wreckage of that wedding day, something new began to rise, something powerful, something unstoppable. By the time Edward's trial began that October, Franklin wasn't the same town it had been in May. People still waved politely on the sidewalk, but there was an undercurrent of tension in every Sunday service, every grocery checkout, every whispered conversation under a porch awning. Some still refused to believe the accusations. That boy had a future, they'd mutter. He wouldn't throw it away like that. Others said nothing at all, but they watched, and they listened. And more importantly, they started asking questions. Our small women's circle had grown quietly through the summer. We held weekly meetings, first in Miss Eugenia's barn, then in the back room of the town's old library. Women brought pie and stories. Some whispered, some cried, some just sat in silence, realizing for the first time that they weren't alone. We weren't prepared for how many would come. 7 women, 7 shared testimonies of encounters with Edward Foster. Some described unwanted touching. Others spoke of threats, cornered moments in alleyways, hands that grabbed too tightly. Heather was the only one he had violated in the most brutal sense, but she wasn't the only one he had harmed. I accompanied Heather to the courthouse on the morning of the trial. She wore a navy blue dress, simple, modest, and firm. Her lip had healed, but the emotional scars were fresher than ever. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. I'm scared, she admitted as we waited to be called in. I am too, I said, squeezing her hand. But remember what you told me. Our silence only protects the guilty. We're done being silent. The courtroom was packed. Even folks from neighboring counties came to witness it. The man who was once the golden boy of Franklin now stood behind a wooden defense table, dressed in a pristine suit, his once confident gaze lowered. He didn't look at Heather. He didn't look at me. Instead, he stared ahead at nothing. The defense lawyer was slick, polished, hired by Edward's father from Nashville. He tried to paint Heather as confused, emotional, possibly even jealous. Why would she open the door to a man she feared he asked the jury? Why not scream for help? Why wait hours to tell anyone, every question cut like a knife? But Heather never flinched. She described everything with devastating clarity, how he blocked the doorway, what he said, how she screamed but no one came. Her voice only broke when she said, he looked me in the eye after and smiled, like he'd done nothing wrong. The courtroom was silent. Mary, Edward's longtime housekeeper, testified next. She had nothing to gain. She was past retirement age, with no family in town. But she came because, in her words, I kept quiet too long, and I won't carry that guilt to my grave. Then came Loretta Simmons, then Julie, the carpenter's daughter, one after another. They stepped forward, not victims, but survivors, not broken women, but brave ones. Each one made Edward's lies harder to defend. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke not as the jilted bride, but as someone who had seen truth claw its way into daylight. I believed I was marrying a good man. I said to the jury, I was wrong. I didn't want to believe my cousin at first, but when I looked into her eyes, I saw something I couldn't deny. And when I spoke the truth in front of 200 people, I didn't just do it for Heather. I did it for every girl who was ever told to stay quiet. By the end of the second day, Edward's defense team rested. He chose not to testify. I wasn't surprised. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned and read the word guilty, a collective breath was released across the room. Heather's shoulders finally dropped. Miss Eugenia placed a steadying hand on mine. Edward was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He stood up and shouted that we were liars, that he'd get out early, that his father would burn this town to the ground. But no one listened to him anymore. As he was dragged from the courtroom, I felt something unexpected, not joy, not relief, but peace, the kind that only comes when truth has finally been spoken aloud, when justice has a name and a face. And in that moment, I knew we had won something far greater than a verdict. We had reclaimed our voices. In the weeks following the trial, Franklin began to heal, but not in the way some had hoped. There were no sweeping declarations, no apologies from those who once whispered that Heather had probably misunderstood or that I had acted out of bitterness. But the whispers stopped, and in their place, there was something new, respect, and maybe a little fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what truth could do when it finally broke through silence. Edward was gone, sent to serve 8 years at the state penitentiary in Nashville. He'd end up serving 6 for good behavior. His father left town within a year, the bank quietly replacing his son with someone less charming and far less dangerous. But the real transformation wasn't in the court or the community, it was in us. Heather, once timid and reserved, began to stand taller. She found a therapist through our support circle and slowly opened herself up again. 2 years later, she met Dr. Samuel Curtis, a kind-hearted physician who moved to Franklin from Asheville. He never once asked her to get over it or move on. He just stayed beside her, steady and warm. They married in a quiet ceremony by the river and eventually had 3 children, each one raised to understand consent, compassion, and courage. As for me, I never married. People assumed it was because of what happened with Edward, but that wasn't the full story. The truth was, something inside me had shifted. I had looked at the world through a veil of lace and fantasy, and then I had ripped it off. What I found on the other side wasn't just ugliness, but purpose. I went back to school. At 28, I enrolled at a community college and then transferred to a state university. I studied law, an unusual path for a woman in the 1960s, especially in small-town Tennessee. I heard the whispers, poor Charlene never got over it. She's trying to be a man. But I didn't care. Every textbook I read, every exam I passed felt like defiance, a reclaiming. Eventually, I returned to Franklin and began practicing family law, often pro bono for women in crisis. The same courtroom where I had once stood trembling became the place where I helped others find strength. Meanwhile, the Franklin Women's Support Circle grew. We moved into a proper building, a 2-story white house on Maplewood Avenue, just 2 blocks from where Edward and I were supposed to live as husband and wife. That house became a sanctuary. Women came not just from Franklin, but from nearby towns Columbia, Spring Hill, even Nashville. They came with bruises, with silence, with children on their hips and fear in their eyes, and we welcomed them all. Heather joined as a volunteer, then later as a full-time counselor. Miss Eugenia sat on our advisory board until the day she passed, leaving behind not just property, but power of voice that had helped birth an entire movement. The wedding dress I never wore, Mama unstitched the bodice and turned it into christening gowns for Heather's children. The orchids that once lined the altar now bloomed in the center's backyard garden, soft and white each spring, like living reminders of what can grow from broken beginnings. I didn't plan this life. I planned for love, for children, for Sunday dinners with a man who kissed my forehead and tucked me into his arms. Instead, I found something stronger, a legacy. And while I may never be a mother by birth, I've mothered generations of Change One story, one voice, one brave woman at a time. By the time the 1990s arrived, the little circle of folding chairs in Miss Eugenia's barn had transformed into something much larger than any of us ever imagined. The Franklin Women's Support Center now occupied a full campus, 4 buildings surrounding a quiet courtyard with blooming magnolias and benches shaded by maple trees. What began with whispered stories over tea had grown into a movement. We had a staff of 23 social workers, counselors, lawyers, nurses, and nearly all of them were women who had once walked through our doors not seeking employment, but refuge. Some had fled abusive marriages. Others had aged out of the foster system with no family to speak of. Each woman brought her own story, and each story added another brick to the foundation we were still building. I was in my 60s by then, my once dark hair silvering, my steps slower. I still worked every day, but I knew the time was coming to pass the torch. Heather had long since become the soul of the center. Her calm voice, her gentle strength, her way of listening without judgment, women trusted her the moment she said, "I understand," because she did understand. Her pain had never been a secret, and she never let it define her. She let it guide her. Her husband, Dr. Curtis, offered free medical care to all our clients. Their 3 children grew up volunteering, sorting supplies, organizing clothing drives, helping with fundraising dinners. I once caught their youngest daughter slipping a $20 bill into our donation jar after selling lemonade on the corner. She couldn't have been more than 10. The circle was growing. And then came Clara Heather's oldest, named after Sheriff Harmon's late wife. Clara Curtis was a force of her own. She was barely in her 20s when she started helping with grant writing and public speaking. But she had Heather's compassion and a fire all her own. She didn't just want to continue our mission, she wanted to evolve it. She talked about digital safety for women being harassed online, about marginalized communities who needed services we weren't reaching. She pushed us to offer legal workshops, language services, childcare options for working mothers trying to leave dangerous homes. At first, some of us older women hesitated. It felt like we were being replaced, but Clara never dismissed us. She honored our stories. She built upon them. You were the roots. She told me once, we're just trying to grow the branches. So, in 1997, at the age of 62, I formally retired as director of the center. We held a modest ceremony in the garden behind the main building. They gave me a plaque I never hung up and a rose bush planted in my honor, right next to the row of orchids transplanted decades earlier from the church where everything began. Heather took over as executive director, and a few years later, she handed the reins to Clara, 3 generations of women, one unbroken thread. Somewhere in that time, a young journalist from Nashville interviewed me for a piece on Southern women and activism. She called me a pioneer. I laughed at that. I wasn't blazing any trail. I said, I just refused to be silent. But she insisted on writing the article. It was published in a regional magazine, and it stirred something unexpected. We began receiving letters from women in Kentucky, Georgia, Arkansas, women who'd never heard of Franklin, Tennessee, until then. Some had been carrying secrets for 50 years. Some were teenagers just trying to escape the patterns they'd grown up in. That's when I realized our story wasn't just ours. It belonged to every woman who'd ever been told to keep quiet. It belonged to every girl who looked in the mirror and wondered if she'd be believed. And it belonged to every survivor who ever stood up. Not because it was easy, but because staying silent hurt even more. Now, I spend my days tending to a much smaller garden in the backyard of the little cottage where I've settled down just outside of town. I still visit the center now and then. I still sit with new volunteers, tell them what it was like to stand at the altar and say no, what it was like to lose everything and still find something greater. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they just nod, wide-eyed. Sometimes they ask me if I ever regret it, and I always give them the same answer, not for a single moment. It's late afternoon now. I sit on the porch of my cottage, a soft blanket over my knees, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in my hands. The Tennessee sun dips low behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The air smells like honeysuckle, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear a child laughing. The garden blooms around me roses, wildflowers, and of course, the orchids. Those same orchids that once lined the aisle of a church I walked down with a broken heart. They still bloom every spring, as if to remind me, even from devastation, something beautiful can grow. I think back to that girl I was in 1957, just 20 years old, full of dreams, full of love, full of trust. I thought I knew what life was. I thought I knew who Edward Foster was. But life, real life, is what happens when illusions are shattered. When you stand in the middle of the rubble and ask yourself, now what? And if you're lucky, if you're brave, you find an answer that's stronger than the dream you lost. My journey was never about vengeance. It was about truth, about protection, about building a place in this world where women could be heard, held, and healed. The Franklin Women's Support Center still stands today, thriving, evolving, and led by women who weren't even born when I walked out of that church without a husband, but with a purpose. Heather still visits often, though she's now a proud grandmother. Clara runs the center with fierce grace, her voice carrying our mission into boardrooms, courtrooms, college campuses. Sometimes, when I sit quietly in the back during one of their town hall meetings, I see young women watching Clara the way I once watched Eugenia, with awe, with hope. The circle continues, and me, I no longer need to lead. But I will always remember a life lesson from Grandma Charlene. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You do not have to remain silent, not for tradition, not for appearances, not for fear of not being believed, because when we speak, we create space for others to speak. When we tell the truth, We light the path for those still trapped in the dark. The world will try to convince you to smile, to stay quiet, to not cause a scene, but silence protects no one but the abuser. If I had walked down that aisle and pretended everything was fine, maybe I would have had a wedding, but I would have lost myself. And worse, I would have failed the women who came after me. So speak, stand, even if your voice shakes, even if you stand alone, because you won't be alone for long. Others will follow. They always do. Now, I want to hear from you. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or someone you love, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandparents' Tales for more stories of strength, healing, and truth. These are not just stories, they're legacies. And together, we're making sure they're never forgotten. Because the fight isn't over. Because there's still so much healing to do. Because our stories matter. Always. Charlene Chapman. The Bride Who Said No.